Greetings, I'm Michael Quinn Patton. The anniversary each year of September 11, 2001 invites us to reflect on what happened that day and the lessons that can be drawn both from the events on September 11 and the aftermath of September 11. It turns out that there are some important evaluation lessons that can be drawn from the ways in which the intelligence community engaged in analyzing what happened before, during, and after 9/11. And that led to 8 important characteristics of quality analysis called the rigor attribute model. This video, then, is going to take us down memory lane to consider how 9/11 came about and what happened afterwards in the intelligence community that has generated what I think are some really critical lessons for evaluation. So we begin with that walk down memory lane, and we'll then, in the end, compare the intelligence community's analysis of what happened in 9/11 to the more recent intelligence community analysis of the origin of COVID-19. Here is September 10th, 2001, and September 11, 2001. And what proceeded from that, in having identified Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan as the mastermind behind the attacks, was an effort to connect Saddam Hussein and Iraq with the Twin Tower attack. That connection was actually never made empirically, but it was alleged. And what it did was allow Donald Rumsfeld and Bush and Cheney to make a case for invading not just Afghanistan, but invading Iraq under the allegation that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and was a threat to the United States because of its connection with Al-Qaeda and with the Osama bin Laden and the terrorist networks. So on March 20th, 2003, the United States began bombing Iraq. This followed Colin Powell's presentation at the United Nations, making the case from the intelligence community that there were a very high probability that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction that threatened the United States. One of the leaders of the US inspection team after the US invaded Iraq has written about the day he realized they would never find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and in fact did not. There had been UN instructors in Iraq before the United States alleged there were weapons of mass destruction. None were found. And when, after a year, no weapons turned up, a commission, which is basically an evaluation of the intelligence capabilities of the US, was formed. And that commission submitted their report in 2005 and concluded that the intelligence community was dead wrong in almost all of its pre-war judgments about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. This was a major intelligence failure. Its principal causes were the intelligence community's inability to collect good information about Iraq's WMD programs, serious errors in analyzing what information it could gather, and a failure to make clear just how much of its analysis was based on assumption rather than good evidence. On a matter of this importance, we simply cannot afford failures of this magnitude. After a thorough review, the commission found no indication that the intelligence community distorted the evidence regarding Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. What the intelligence professionals told you about Saddam Hussein's programs was what they believed. They were simply wrong. So let me be sure we're connecting the dots. 9/11 attack on the World Trade Center, seeking to go after those who are responsible. Osama bin Laden is identified. He's in Afghanistan, and forces go into Afghanistan in search of Osama bin Laden. At the same time, Bush, Cheney, and Rumsfeld begin to target Iraq, claiming both a connection to the World Trade Center attack, which never was made, and there was no connection, and the weapons of mass destruction. And so what this leads us to is a sense of where rigor of thinking comes in. I've written about this as one of my ruminations in the qualitative evaluation book, because what I came across on the 10th anniversary of the 9/11 was a group of intelligence officials who were involved in that data collection that was so wrong, who were a part of the intelligence community in some 13 different US agencies that was charged with determining what the probability was of weapons of mass destruction. They came out of that period and that report entirely discouraged. Imagine that the American Evaluation Association had undertaken a high-profile evaluation of a national issue and found to be completely wrong, with its most prestigious members having been involved in the evaluation. That's what happened to the intelligence community. And they gathered in 2006 at Ohio State University for a retreat to figure out what had gone wrong. And what came out of that was a macro cognitive framing of information analysis as sense making that became a rebuttal to what they called the shallow analysis that they had fallen into. And they created out of that the rigor attribute model. Rigor is not understood by assessing the deviations of process, which is a reliability kind of concern, but rather by assessing the contextual sufficiency of many different aspects of the analytic process. They took what they called a cognitive systems approach. While professional intelligence analysts can make perceptive assessment about quality of analysis based on product quality, those perceptions are apt to change with insight into the analytic process. And so what emerged out of the intelligence community's reflection and their evaluation of how wrong they got it and why was a way of thinking about analysis that they call the rigor attribute model. And they identified 8 characteristics of thinking rigorously. So part of whenever I come up on the anniversary of 9/11, what comes up for me is this chain of events from 9/11 to the invasion of Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq, and the intelligence community examining how they got it so wrong, and the rigor attribute model as a foundation of evaluative thinking. The 8 characteristics they identified are information search, that is being sure to look for multiple kinds of information, what we would call being sure that you've got mixed methods. What happened, it turns out, in the large number of US agencies, each of whom had their own intelligence gathering process, they all did their own independent analysis and came together, but they wouldn't share their information with each other. They only shared their conclusions. They all concluded that there was a high probability that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. It turned out that they were all using the same single key informant who had the CIA had given the code name Curveball because he was a disaffected former high-level official in Saddam Hussein's cabinet who was getting paid to provide information to these different intelligence agencies. And when the 13 different agencies all came together and concluded that there were likely weapons of mass destruction, but wouldn't reveal what their information was, it turned out they were all using the same single source. Hypothesis exploration, the extent to which multiple hypotheses are considered in explaining data. In a low rigor process, there's minimal weighing of alternatives. And so they didn't give serious attention to alternative hypotheses, one of which was that Saddam Hussein had talked about having weapons of mass destruction and pretended to have them as a way of building up his own reputation, as a way of threatening Iran, of a way of being a major player in the Middle East and in the world, and that it was about his ego and his trying to show that he was a world player, when in fact they didn't have the capability to do weapons of mass destruction. Other hypotheses, they ended focusing in on the simple question, does Iraq have weapons of mass destruction, instead of asking a broader range of questions about what's going on in Iraq, how do they connect to 9/11, what is the likelihood they're a threat to the United States. They got narrowed down and focused on this one piece with not much information. The information validation details the level at which information sources are corroborated and cross-validated. So having multiple sources, validating the intersection of those, they didn't do. Stance analysis is evaluation of data with the goal of identifying the stance or perspective of the source and placing it into a broader context. So it's a recognition that data comes with perspective, that it has to be interpreted. What's the stance of interpretation? What's the value frame that's affecting this? Sensitivity analysis considers the extent to which the analyst considers and understands the assumptions and limitations of their analysis. They moved right past their assumptions, both about their key informant and about the very nature of the question that they were inquiring into. Specialist collaboration describes the degree to which an analyst incorporates the perspectives of domain experts into their assessment. One of the things they did not do was include any of the other intelligence agencies in the world. Europe, Israel, the United Nations had weapons inspectors in Iraq right up until the time that the Iraq invasion began. And so what you had was an insider group of Americans under heavy political pressure to find a positive finding that there were weapons of mass destruction, and not consulting with other intelligence agencies and worldwide who had very different information. Information synthesis refers to how far beyond simply collecting and listing data analysts went in their process. Did they work to really make sense of this? Michael Scriven in The Logic of Evaluation considers information synthesis the crown jewel of sense making and evaluation, pulling the data together to reach an overall informed judgment. And finally, explanation critique is a different form of collaboration that captures how many different perspectives were incorporated in examining the primary hypotheses. This is another form of triangulation. What are different ways of explaining the data? And to be sure that there are people advocating for those different perspectives. This is a version of what in the Catholic Church Inquisition was called the devil's advocate. The role of the devil's advocate in the Catholic Inquisition in the Middle Ages, when someone was accused of being a witch or a devil or a heretic, the devil's advocate job was to try to convince the clergy that this person was not in the devil's employ, and a person was assigned to make that case, became known as the devil's advocate, being sure that there were other explanations for what was going on. In combination, the rigor attribute model is a set of ways of thinking about data, both what's gathered, how it's made sense of, and the high stakes of doing this. Another Nobel Prize winner in physiology said discovery consists of looking at the same thing as everyone else and thinking something different. To make sense of, fully understand, interpret, and apply scientific and evaluation findings, we have to spend time with the results, discuss them, delve deeply into their implications, discuss what they reveal, and what remains unknown. Now we fast forward to 2021, when the intelligence services in the United States were tasked with investigating the origin of the coronavirus, whether it came from the laboratory in Wuhan or from the open market, and the intelligence assessment of implications for United States national security. That report has a very different tone and set of findings than did the report about weapons of mass destruction for Iraq. Now, the tone of the rigor attribute model in this, I realize this is small print, but this is the actual report that they released. And it says, after examining all available intelligence reporting and other information, though, the intelligence community, I see as the intelligence communities, multiple agencies, remains divided on the most likely origin of COVID-19. All agencies assess that two hypotheses are plausible: natural exposure to an infected animal and a laboratory-associated incident. They then go on, they then go in to identify their differences of opinion and the ways in which different kinds of evidence takes them in different directions, and the likelihood that this will never be fully determined. So that this is a report that recognizes ambiguity, that doesn't force a conclusion, and actually provides alternative hypotheses, looks at multiple sources of data, examines different explanations, and it looks to me like it's very much influenced by the rigor attribute model. Especially found it powerful that they acknowledge what they didn't know and what they disagreed about. None of that was in the weapons of mass destruction report. They forced a consensus, and they did not report the contrary data. In conclusion, the lessons from the two different intelligence reports, the weapons of mass destruction report and the origin of the coronavirus, give us two ways of understanding what rigor means for evaluation. Rigor in the rigor attribute model resides in rigorous thinking, not in methods. Any methods can be well used or poorly used, but rigor resides in deep, critical, evaluative thinking. Methods can be well used or poorly used. Any kind of methods can be well used or poorly used. But rigorous thinking, deep, critical, evaluative thinking about the data, the interpretation of the data, engagement with each other and stakeholders about what the data mean, considering alternative hypotheses, using multiple sources of data. Rigorous evaluative thinking is the source of rigor, not methods. That's the lesson that I take away from the rigor attribute model and the intelligence community's experience with 9/11.